Okay, I don't have a lot of time right now, nor am I necessarily looking the most presentable. Nevertheless, I wanted to record a short video on my argument and express it in a simple and concise form. Simpler is better. Simpler is always better. And over these last few weeks, months, even this whole past year, maybe even more than that, I've been thinking about ways to make this argument for papal infallibility sharper and better. Um, Here in brief is the sharpest way that I know how to do this as of yet, which is to say that the first premise is God may certain things may be known about God through general revelation, but they are very generic. This is an argument about, how do you find out which church is true, assuming that you attach great importance to the figure of Jesus Christ. Maybe you've had a personal encounter with him. You're otherwise captivated by him, but you want to know which tradition speaks the truth about him. And so we want to know which church is true. What we notice is that the churches are all divided on questions that really, for the most part, do seem to be questions of special revelation. They are agreeing on the most generic points that would be revealed about God through general revelation. I mean, for the most part. And as far as what is actually clearly deducible about God from general revelation, it's itself a murky question. And my own suspicion would be not a great deal. But when it comes to special revelation, truths such as that God is three persons in one being, for example, or that Jesus is one person in two natures, that he has two intellects, two wills, according to each nature, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son, or the contrary position on all of those questions. Those are all special revelation type questions. And the question is whether can human beings deduce these sort of things about God a priori through unaided human reason? Now, rather than really have to spin our gears trying to figure out, the answer to this kind of question that we might not be equipped to answer, just assume what if it was the case that we could? What would it sort of suggest about God? It would suggest that God is this sort of finite, intractable subject like geometry, something we can figure out totally independent of its own willingness to be figured out. And the other end of the continuum would be to say that God is this infinite and sovereign someone that you really can only understand, at least with respect to special revelation truth claims, to the extent that he wants to be discovered or found or understood by you. And you see that this is really actually not binary, but it's a continuum. So on the one hand would be the claim that, God is absolutely rigorously deducible a priori through unaided human reason. No need to submit to any external authority. Doesn't matter if he wants to be found or not. You can just figure it all out in your mind from the armchair. I don't know that many Christians would endorse that view. And then on the other view is there's so many different ways, as far as we know, that it might be that God is. So many different possibilities as regards the answers to these sorts of special revelation questions that your chances of being right by chance are just vanishingly small. And in the middle, there's actually sort of a middle space where if you say, well, okay, I can't rigorously deduce certain truths about him a priori, but really, come on, how complicated can he be? How many ways can there be? I mean, it's a funny question because in a certain way, God is one. God is paradoxical. Everything he does is perfectly necessary yet perfectly free. But he's not random. So, there's an explanation that is sought and found for everything he does that's sort of in his own nature. And But nonetheless, as it were, for modeling purposes, if we are not well placed to understand God, we have to sort of treat him as if he were capable of anything, even if he's, in a certain sense, really not. Um, uh, and so that means that as far as modeling purposes go, we have to admit there are many possibilities to the extent that he's mysterious. If we say that, well, I don't claim to be able to deduce certain truths about him a priori through my unaided human reason, but I can get pretty close, or I can get like, I have like a 1/3 chance of being right. Because realistically, it's only three different ways it could be, or something like that. I don't think a lot of people would take that view. Or I mean, to the extent that you take a view that admits of our being able to get sort of real positive knowledge, or at least approximations thereof, of the divine nature, you're just making him a thing or a finite tractable subject that can be understood independently of its or his own willingness to be understood, as opposed to an infinite and sovereign someone who is only understood to the extent that he lets you find him and wants to be found. And so really most Christians are going to come and land on the far end of that continuum, the sovereignty end. And what that means is that when it comes to understanding God, it would be that either you can figure him out on your own, or if not, you must submit to an authority. It's his authority, essentially, God's own authority. Um, yeah, you can't figure anything about him out for yourself. You must take God at his word. You are dependent on some authoritative revelation from him. Now, this authoritative revelation can either be immediate or immediate. In the case where it's immediate, like imparted directly to you, God can do that because he's God. It's not for me to say he can't just hit some Chinese person with the revelation that he's triune, and that the God of the universe is triune, and that uh, the Son of God is uh, fully human and fully divine, and he died for the sins of the world, and all of Christian theology. God is God. I know he could do that. I don't know if he has ever done anything like that, but the point is, if we say this is the normative or expected way of finding out which church is true, it's just he has to hit you with some immediate download, so you're getting his authority, but without a mediator. Um, then there's no sense debating about theology, because it's just a whole question of whether you've had some unverifiable experience or not. And it's summarizing a lot, but basically that's what it is. So it has to be an authority, and for the debate of which church is the true church to even be worth having, you need to assume it is a sort of public, intersubjectively checkable authority, which indeed all versions of Christianity assume that it is. Catholics say it's, you got popes and bishops and scriptures and tradition and a magisterium, all these things. Eastern Orthodox, yeah, all that minus the Pope. Um, Protestants, well, we don't have all those human authorities. We just have the Word of God. But that's still a public, intersubjectively checkable authority, because imagine if Protestantism were taken to its logical conclusion of, well, these books were authored by people. Who knows if that's true? I'm only going to take as truth what the Holy Spirit reveals to me personally, solus spiritus. It'd be quite chaotic. And I mean, maybe that is how it works, but in that sense, in that case, there would just be no sense debating theology. Um, so what we're getting at is we're dependent on a public authority in order to understand things about God. But note the spot that we're sort of in, because if we have to decide among different authorities, if the only way we can tell which authority is authoritative with regard to God is by already knowing who's right about teaching, then either we have to be able to sort of independently deduce the truths of those teachings or claims for ourselves, which we cannot do, or we have to receive it on the authority that is in on the very authority that is in question. It has to be a circular logic where, well, how do I know not the filioque, monopatrism? How do I know that is true? Because the Eastern Orthodox Church is trustworthy. Okay, cool. How do I know Eastern Orthodox Church is trustworthy? Because they're right on all the doctrines. It's like, that's circular. It's not so great. Um, but sometimes circular epistemology is the best you've got. It's not intrinsically irrational when there's no alternative. Um, but, being as we have sort of come to this point where we realize the only way we're knowing anything about God is through an authority, a public one, um, it is worth noting that, well, okay, so, this is where we're at basically. Now, either you are inside the true church or you are not. That sounds fair. Um, in the event that you are not in the true church, is there any clear authority-based move that is open to you? Not obviously, or not in any simple or straightforward sense. There's no. If I'm an atheist who just encountered Christ last night, and I wake up like, oh, gee, I want to go find the true church. Um, I'm not under a bishop or anyone that I can submit to that he's going to tell me, who's right on doctrine or anything like that. So, but take it if someone is inside the church. You can sort of rewind the tape back to the very beginning when Christ ascends to heaven and the apostles begin the church. And then questions of doctrine arise. Basically, churches or factions split depending on the way they answer those questions. And so there's choice point A, maybe Paul versus the Judaizers. Mainstream Christianity chooses Paul. Choice point B is Nicaea. Mainstream Christianity chooses Trinity. Choice point C, I'm forgetting my councils, but like Ephesus, most of Christianity decides Jesus is one person, and such that you can say of him that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is ipso facto the mother of God. And so on. It's all these choice points. Every schism, it's been like a breaking up of the church into two, and so you're almost at the end of time. From an outsider point of view, you're what is it they say, at sixes and sevens, or is that just what the kids say, 6 7? I have no idea, but you're at odds to find out which one is the real church, right? But if you're looking at it from like inside the true church, like from the beginning, and you had to be, before it split, it was necessarily true, let's assume. I mean, there is the case where, as soon as Christ left, everyone got it wrong, but this is going to be a clear pattern that emerges where you can only find God in the case where he wants to be found. It just follows in a very simple logical way that if you assume he does not want to be found, you can assume that you are not going to find him. So it's kind of like looking for your keys under the light, if that's the only place you can find it. And if, sort of, we have no reason to believe the keys would not be under the light, sort of with any less probability than they might be anywhere else. It does sort of in that way become rational to look under the light, so to speak. It's not rational to bet on the case where you're basically assured to not find it. So, we're going to assume that the true church in the beginning, the undivided one, was true. Let's say that. We're going to assume the church in the beginning that was undivided was true. Now, for people in that church, at every moment of schism, they would have had two choices. One is authority based and one is personal verification based, which, as we kind of discovered, is nothing. Like, it's either, if you claim you're submitting to an authority but you only credit that authority as authoritative because you think he's right on doctrine, you're not. It's circular and you're not actually really submitting to an authority. You're implicitly relying on your own ability to do certain truths for yourself about the undeducible one. Um, and So the other move is submit to the head. I don't. It's like, who's right on this question? Filioque, whatever. I don't know. I'll submit to the top guy, or the guy that was previously regarded by everyone to be the top guy until some of them decided he fell into error. That's the way it is with every non-Catholic um, form of Christianity. Um, that it's the same story with each non-Catholic form of Christianity. They just differ as to what point it was that the, if only nominal or honorary head of the church um, fell into error and ceased to become reliable. So, it's sort of natural that if you don't know the answer for yourself, you would submit to the head, whose job it ostensibly is to shepherd and guide you. It's quite rational, in other words, if you don't know, to submit to the top guy rather than your neighbor Randall. You know, but and it's also an authority-based move. That's the only authority-based move that's open. Or at least that's public authority. Because I mean, you could say, well, Holy Spirit convicted me that filioque is not true, say, and that's subjective. It's immediate, and you can say it's based on that. But in that case, just let's not debate theology anymore. Um, so you will see that in every church split, people always have the choice to either submit to the authority, make the authority-based move, or try to figure things out for themselves and make their determination as to which church is the truth by figuring things out for themselves. It may be that they end up in the same church as the top guy, or it may not. But those are the two moves that are open to them. And from this, it's not hard to see that in a tautological sense, the only version of Christianity in which it is possible to make the authority-based move and successfully remain in the true church in so doing at every point is the case in which papal infallibility is true. And very specifically, Vatican I style papal infallibility, where not only has the Pope been right on every question up until now, but he is assured of being right on every future question. Every future question. Because only in that, see, if he was just right on everything up until right now, but then the church splits again tomorrow. I mean, yeah, technically the popes have had a really good track record. Let's assume we can somehow know. But I don't know. No, it's still possible they could be wrong. Whenever you don't really know that you're bound to be right by submitting to someone based on his authority, then the real implicit standard is what you can verify for yourself. So the only case in which we can make the public authority-based move, believing the top guy just because he's the top guy, not because we think he's right on doctrine, and be assured that it's going to land you in the true church, not just for every previous decision, but for every possible future decision, is the one in which the head of the church is specifically protected against, at a minimum, binding the faithful to error on like these sort of de fide matters of truth and morals and doctrine and all this. This is a priori, one can see that this is the only condition under which we can properly receive some highly specified account, say, of special revelation truth, such that it would let us discriminate among the different churches to find the true one on the basis of authority. Papal infallibility is the only case in which we can properly receive this kind of knowledge on the basis of authority as such, as opposed to implicitly what we can verify for ourselves. And granted, it is a judgment of sorts, even perhaps in some strained sense, a theological judgment to say that I'm not qualified to make theological judgments. But if it is the case that God's only willing to, can only be found to the extent that He's willing to be found, and otherwise you can't find anything about Him out on your own, then that's just the way the cookie crumbles. You know in that case that you cannot know. So now that would be on papal infallibility. Submit to the top guy because he's the top guy would be the insider principle of Christianity. The insider ecclesiological principle, where that would be for those who are inside the church. Now you're outside the church, you're not under any authority, but you know authority is the only way you can receive this faith. So how do you decide which church is true? I would submit. The now fairly obvious logical move is to decide which church is true based on which one allows at least the insider principle of ecclesiology to be one of just submit to the head because he's the head. Because in every other case, it will rest on an ability that you do not possess. It is to assume, in a certain sense, if you assume that God has not, let's look at it like this. If papal infallibility is not true, the undesirable consequences of this is not the way that it's usually represented. It's not that, there's no guy to make infallible calls, so people are going to debate forever. I mean, maybe it's kind of like that in a sense. But if we don't have some one person at the top, we can't make definitive judgments. No, that's not the problem. The problem is that if the top guy is not trustworthy because he's the top guy, then we got a problem. Because in our timeline, at least, it's not the case that bishops, ordinary bishops, are trustworthy just because they're bishops, or councils just because they're councils, or pastors just because they're pastors, or priests because they're priests, or guys with an MDiv just because they're guys with an MDiv. On anybody's account of Christianity, you can find people who have these qualifications, but who cannot necessarily be accepted as telling the truth just because of those qualifications. The only case in which you could submit to someone and or something, the institution that he presides over, because again, his infallibility is only very qualified and limited, and it's more so attached to his role or office rather than to him personally. Because it's a function of what God does sovereignly to preserve the church from error, not so much a function of human excellence. Really, not at all a function of human excellence, which history has given us sufficient occasion to take note of. Now, what was I saying? In other words, as far as I'm concerned, at least, the problem with denying papal infallibility is just that it murders our ability to believe someone, and in the limit, or by extension, something, anything, anyone, anything, just because of who or what they are. Just the way that in our timeline, the way the cookie crumbles is, if this is not true, it will never be possible to receive it on the basis of authority. So what follows from this? What follows is that if papal infallibility is not true, you can just basically assume there's a certain sense in which God is not willing to be found, because he has not given that bridge of authority, which is the a priori requirement for you to be able to find him, at least on the supposition that this debate is not subjective, that the theological issues about which we debate do admit of some kind of objective resolution in and of themselves, which is really, every time people are throwing down theological arguments, that's sort of the implicit assumption on which the whole business rests. And I'm going to submit that they do admit of some kind of objective resolution in and of themselves, sort of. Really, the only thing we can know about God is that without authority we cannot know anything about him, which can tell us which, in an indirect way, which church is the right one. And then once we have that authority foundation, then we can know theological truths based on that. So I've suggested that, if papal infallibility is true, the insider principle. Okay, you don't know if papal infallibility is true, but you know it's either true or it's not true. That's fair, yeah? And if it is true, you know that the insider principle of ecclesiology, at least, is submit, submit, submit to the head because he's the head. You don't have to figure it out for yourself at the object level. All you have to figure it out is that you can't figure it out, Socrates. Um, and in the case where papal infallibility is not true, the only way anyone's going to keep landing in the right church is if they can figure out the issues for themselves, which they can't. Not in any properly non-circular fashion, which means to say it's completely unguided and random, really, to the extent that we lack any independent insight into the divine essence, which is, you know, completely, like 100%, we lack it. Or as close to 100% as makes no difference. The idea is God is so infinite and sovereign and mysterious that your chances of being right about him by chance are vanishingly small. Yeah. Um, so let me see. So we know papal infallibility is either true or not true. In the case where it is true, the insider principle of ecclesiology can at least be that you submit to the head because he's the head. And if it's not true, there's no real authority-based submission principle. You have at best circular epistemology. Now, it could be that way. It could be papal infallibility is false, such that the only way we can know which church is true is through a circular reasoning. But really, in order to show that papal infallibility is false based on object level theological reasoning, the best we can hope to offer is a circular reasoning. But circular reasoning is a thing where it may be rational to do it when there's no non-circular alternative. But in this case, in this tautological disjunction, either X or not X, I've shown you there is a non-circular alternative where if we assume it is true, we're assuming essentially that God is just night and day, not exponentially, just night and day, 0 and 1, um, uh, more willing to be found. Infinitely more willing to be found, as it were. And you don't know that he is willing to be found, but you do know that you're not finding him in the case where he isn't. So pragmatically, it shifts the calculus to where you can and you must. The only real live option for you is you gotta throw in your bet with the case in which God is more willing to be found or maximally willing to be found. Because could be, God would have always had a sign that flashes neon that says this church is right. Could have been, but that's not existing in our timeline. So when I say maximal, I mean the one in our timeline, the option that is on which he is most accessible. Granted, he has not made himself sort of arbitrarily or per impossibly infinitely obvious. There's limits to that. But I'm saying the game theory, or like sort of your pragmatic judgment call, it favors always betting on the case where God is making himself most accessible. And so really the only serious objections to this argument are going to be objections that we can find the true church using criteria that are not special revelation based. I have previous videos addressing this and showing how really in principle there can be no principled way of finding the true church that is not making assumptions about special revelation. And the reason why is really not hard to see, which is, let's take an example first, and then I'll talk about the reason. Like, people say, well, you can tell which church is true based on who most resembles the early church. First of all, like in what respect? But second of all, if this tradition, like say the Eastern Orthodox, has any identifiable instance of development, and it's easy to find them, And what that means is either they're false, or, and really the no church is correct. We have to return to some originalism that really doesn't currently exist. Um, or uh, development is not inherently bad. Maybe it's clarification. And when you call it that, it sounds good. Like the church with maybe, presumably, the true church is the one with the most clarification rather than the least. I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying where if it's not intrinsically bad, we just don't know in principle whether the true church is the one that has the least or the most development slash clarification. And indeed, how could you, unless you had that ability to just look up and independently verify certain features of the divine essence about whom you know nothing. Um, uh, and there's more examples I can give like this. But basically, the idea of trying to find it on non-special revelation based grounds is a no-go. Um, the last one would be to say that some non-Catholic option admits of you making um, some non-Catholic object basically um, some non-Catholic option basically assumes that God is is making himself maximally accessible in such a way that it is pragmatically wise to bet on this case, wiser to bet on it than on the case where we assume Catholicism is true, because some non-Catholic version of Christianity has as its entailment that God has, on this view, made himself more accessible. But the issue here, I can show this now somewhat formally. I couldn't in the previous videos, but now I can. Um, the issue is this: Catholicism is able to claim to be, at least potentially, uniquely access maximal in certain ways. First of all, it's always had the most geohistorical coverage. In terms of space and time, it's always been the biggest. And uh, the other thing is it has the most people, and pretty much always has had. So in that sense of access maximality, Catholicism is going to win on very objective grounds. But the other sense is sort of like maybe it has to do with quality. Maybe it has to do with, you know, um, in what depth or with what level of intimacy we can know God. Um, and someone might say, if you can just know God through the Bible alone, that's more intimate. It's less mediated. Cool. You know what's even more intimate than that is if you have no Bible and it's solus spiritus. Um, but they're not willing to go that far because they know the chaos that results. So, in other words, we know there's more than one factor at play here, such that we can't actually just make the call reliably on our own because we don't know nothing about the divine nature independently. Um, or someone might just say, well, if you pick up the Bible and just read what it says, it most naturally points to some kind of low church Baptist theology. Now, that's actually extremely, disputable and debatable, but I'm trying to bypass all that debate. I'll just concede it and I'll say, maybe, but here's what it is: that this is still assuming some kind of view of ecclesiology where the only source that's open is the Bible. But if we're assuming like an access max, so yeah, in other words, it's access maximal when we make that assumption that it's Bible only. But what do we know about God a priori that we can know that he would make it so that it is Bible only? To say that, it would avoid the need to continually defer to corrupt leaders and institutions is just to beg the question against the idea that they would ever be corrupt at the level of dogmatic definition that actually matters. So let me see. So basically, oops. What's this? Okay, so I have shown, why this basically fails. It's just assuming the Protestant model of ecclesiology and assuming that it can't possibly be the case that God, in order to make himself maximally accessible, has instituted a magisterium that interprets the Bible and shows that certain interpretations are not available, others can be held as legitimate theological opinions. If God wanted to make himself maximally accessible, who's to say he would not have done it this way? And see, this is all the Catholic position needs to be able to do, is just potentially uniquely maximize accessibility. Because, if you know anything, say, about possible world semantics, of which I'm not the biggest fan, but was it Kripke or somebody did something cool where he was just like, look, showing the interdefinition of modal operators possibly and necessarily, where possibly means not necessarily not, and necessarily means not possibly not. So, in other words, if Catholicism is possibly uniquely maximizing accessibility, then what that means is every other position is like, uh, as it were, if you permit me this expression, necessarily then every other church position, every non-Catholic position, um, is not necessarily maximizing um, accessibility. And what that means is that if it's not necessarily maximizing it, the only case in which it is maximizing it is in which we get to make some illegitimate, actually, theological assumption. That's the only. That's, again, this is the example, and then this is the proof of the logic. If Catholicism is possibly uniquely maximizing uh, accessibility, then necessarily nobody else is necessarily maximizing. Everybody else is only also possibly maximizing. Um, and so, and do not mistake my argument. My argument is not that, well, because, maybe, um, maybe the most, maybe the way that God would be most accessible is if he allowed um, people to be able to trust in a magisterium or something when it comes to interpreting his best-selling book about himself. Like, from this we can know that Catholicism is true. That's not my argument. I don't claim to be able to know anything about the divine nature that he would have necessarily set it up that way. For all I know, maybe it would be the book, but nobody knows. That's the whole issue. Not without being able to, because the whole question is always, you know something. Okay, cool. From whom did you learn it? An authority? How do you know that authority is valid in a non-circular way? The only alternative to that is I looked up and saw it, right? Basically. So that's the spot. It's almost like the sort of ecclesiological version of Agrippa's trilemma. Um, Basically, on this first order or positive level, we can't know anything about, or this object level, we can't know anything about God, because we really began with the supposition that all we can know about the divine essence is that we can't know anything specific about him on our own. So, what that means is our only hope is some version of Christianity which allows, like, on a sort of second order level, there to be some option for you to submit to in just that case where you can't figure out anything for yourself, which, as we already saw through the discussion of the game theory, as it were, just analyzing every case, it is Catholicism. That's the only condition necessary. It's like papal infallibility is a priori necessary. It's like the necessary condition for us to be able to receive enough of this faith um, on authority properly, enough of this faith to make a judgment about which church is true and which others are false. So again, I've said that God is only knowable to the extent that he's willing to be known, and what this means is that you are only possibly learning who he is by submitting to an authority, and this debate is only objective where that authority is public and intersubjectively checkable, um, and therefore, pragmatically, you are forced to bet on the state of affairs that assumes that God is most willing to be found by you. And Catholicism is that version, because the only version in which you can submit to God, the only version of Christianity in which you can submit to God on the basis of some kind of public authority, um, is papal infallibility slash Catholicism. Um, and as I showed, attempts to show that uh, some kind of special revelation adjacent but not inherently special revelation criteria will let you do it are they're a no-go, and really for logically necessary reasons. In principle, there can be no principled basis on which to find the true church other than to submit to the public authority. And the reason being is we already just supposed from the outset that there's no understanding God on your own, and that the other thing is there's not another version of Christianity that makes it so that um, pragmatically it's wiser to bet on them, because that version of Christianity assumes a state of affairs in which God has made himself more accessible. There is none, as I showed, necessarily, so long as Catholicism even just possibly uniquely maximizes God's accessibility, which that means everybody else is not necessarily maximizing it, which means they only do maximize it, can be shown to maximize it in the case where we get to make some extra theological assumption. So again, I'm saying, in other words, there's no alternative to submitting to the public authority that is not circular or based on a kind of epistemic hubris whereby we think we have independent insight into the divine nature. Um, Gee whiz, and so that, how to put it, this is not surprising. Why? Because if it's the case that we're only discovering God to the extent that he's willing to be found by us, then what that means is that it he, in a certain sense, the most, God knows, as it were, the most valid train of reasoning for us mortals to pursue is that we're forced to bet on the condition in which he's maximally accessible. And you can say that he has positioned the true answer in such a way that there could be no rival in terms of accessibility. Um, it's like, um, that based on his infinity, his sovereignty, his mysteriousness, that he would have had to maximize accessibility um, for you to have a chance of finding him. And from that, he has maximized accessibility in the case of Catholicism. Um, that um, that the Catholicism is the right answer, and the one in which that he, so to speak, intends to be the right answer. Because God is not going to endorse a method to find the church that's not actually logically sound. I mean, the only case one could make that, like maybe God is actually going to rely on people's false sense of knowing stuff about theology that they don't actually know, in order to, like, what, the ends justify the means, maximize the number of people who end up finding the true church. Well, guess what? Catholicism is the only case in which the number of people who have found the true church, the number of Christians who have found the true church, is the one in which uh, that number has been maximized. Catholicism has a lock on it. So it really makes no sense whatsoever to assume that God would have intended anything other than a sort of truthful or realistic approach to finding the true church, assuming he wants to be found at all. And we don't really get to make the other assumption, or there's no upside to it. There's only downside. And that's the position we're necessarily in if we're only finding God in the case where he wants to be found by us. That's just necessarily how it is. So, and remember, principally, the way in which God has made himself accessible is qualitative, is a how, is through the bridge of authority. The Pontifex Maximus, aptly so called, because Pontifex means bridge maker. Um, and I'm going to write a book about this relatively soon. I intend to title it, at least as of now, "He is not far," Paul's words. And God did this so that they would grope for him and reach out for him and perhaps find him, though in truth he is not far from any one of us. And subtitle, "Why the True Church Must Be Catholic." It really has to do with access maximality and our being forced to bet on the situation in which God's accessibility has been maximized. And by doing this, I hope to show that we don't have to just endlessly debate individual theological issues anymore, which is what everybody seems to be doing, which is crazy. And everybody realizes on some level that it's crazy because, like, why would Jesus set it up this way when the Bible is full of mentions of like how the worldly wise and the learned are not going to find God, the childlike and submissive will. It's crazy, but at the same time, we love Christ, so and we assume theology matters if Christianity is the one true religion, if it's not just some relativism where they're all equally true. So wouldn't it follow that once you get inside Christianity, theology would continue to matter? It would be weird if it stopped mattering just once you got inside the ambit of Christianity. So theology is theoretically really important. I have previous videos talking about like theoretically it's infinitely important, even if it's only like, let's say Catholicism increases your chances of getting to heaven, if we may put it so crassly, or of maximizing your intimacy with God by 2.1x, and Eastern Orthodoxy, the next best thing, is doing so only by 2.0x. If you take that difference, however small, and multiply it by infinity, which is in some tortured sense the duration of eternity, it's an infinite difference. It's either infinitely important, or if it has no bearing on like your ultimate like intimacy with God and or chances of salvation, it's just not worth bothering with, right? So theology is really important, but the only way we know to show which church is the true church is by just showing who happens to be right on every single issue, which is at best showing why like it's showing why everyone else is wrong. On some future unexamined issue, it could be that you too are wrong. Unfortunately, it doesn't follow from the wrongness of someone else that you're in the right. But if you have no way to answer the question of which church is the true church that does not offer an explanation as to why the true church is true and instead can only show why others are false, then you're stuck playing that game, which is a go nowhere game, because we have no independent insight into the divine nature. We can never really, I from this at this point, I it doesn't seem to me we can have any confidence at all in any of our personal theological conclusions, except to the extent that they would presuppose that God is more willing to be found, um, uh, than some other view might presuppose. You would have to argue it solely in terms of that. Hermeneutical naturalness is a valid way to do that. But at the end of the day, people of good faith reach all different conclusions hermeneutically. It's no bueno. So we need to know the reason why the true church is true, and not just why everyone else is wrong. We need a true expression that has a free variable. We don't want a piecewise, enumerative patchwork case that just picks up the concrete pieces, but is left forcing you to like investigate every single issue forever, conceivably, because it's only inductive, right? We need a deductive approach, not an inductive one. And so hopefully this argument will offer a roadmap for how to do that, and will make it clear that Jesus was not mincing words when he said in Matthew 16 to Peter that you are Peter, you are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church. I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. And if he did not uphold that leader through his own sovereign might, there would be no hope of theological knowledge or anything, worthy of the term whatsoever. So that's my presentation. This is dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Mother Mary, pray for us. Sacred Heart of Jesus, have mercy on us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. God bless you. Thank you.